The transport bar in SoundBridge is located on the bottom of the window. It lets you control the main aspects of your project as well as how you interact with it. The first thing to notice is the SoundBridge logo in the bottom left corner, which toggles the full screen function. Right next to it is the Help menu. This Help menu will display the name, shortcut, and value of all SoundBridge parameters you hover your mouse over. Above them are menu buttons. The File menu button lets you create a new project or open an existing one. Here you can also save the project currently open, save it incrementally, which preserves the previous version and saves the new one by appending an integer suffix to the end of its name, or save it under a different name. Here you can also import audio and MIDI files. You can freeze the tracks that put strain on your CPU, rendering them to a new audio track, audio file on your hard drive, or have them rendered in place. You could also export MIDI tracks from your project as MIDI files on your hard drive and audio from your project contained within the loop boundaries. Here you can log out or exit SoundBridge when your creative process for the day is done, or open another project from the list of those you recently worked on. Edit menu offers the basic editing functions and more. After the standard undo and redo functions for the last step you did in the project, you have a cut, copy, and paste, which will work on tracks, mixer channels, plugins, MIDI mapping lanes, audio, MIDI and automation blocks, MIDI notes, and automation points. Paste to a selected track will paste content copied from a different track onto the currently selected one. Here you can also rename, delete, or duplicate the elements of your project, as well as select all of the same kinds of elements. Group Tracks lets you group tracks together, which is routing those tracks' audio to a new channel strip so they can be processed together. Loop Selected Blocks will set the loop in the sequencer to encompass all of the currently selected blocks. Split allows you to split all the elements under the playhead in the project. Merge will join two or more of the selected elements on a track into a single block object, which is really good for arrangements and keeping your projects neat and organized. Adjust Length rounds the duration of selected MIDI notes to the nearest increment determined by the beat selector to the right of the snap function, to which we will get to soon. Finally, Quantize rounds the position of selected MIDI notes and automation points to the nearest increment determined by the beat selector. When we open the Options menu, the first thing we see is the Preferences. This is where you can set up the core of SoundBridge. In it, you will find the main set of dialogues to make SoundBridge run smooth as butter. You can set up your audio device, your MIDI interfaces, you can set your plugin location so that SoundBridge knows where your plugins are. The Blacklist section allows you to blacklist problematic plugins that cause instability so that they wouldn't be scanned on system startup. Shortcuts section allows you to change the default shortcuts. And here you will also find functionality that can be changed in the sequencer, in the way that plugins are handled, recording options. You can change the GUI look, and that goes for color, scale, and you can choose if the widgets can float. Of course, you can also restore widgets to default. The global section holds all of the global settings for SoundBridge. Going back to options, punch in and out will help you limit the recording to just a portion of the timeline within the loop markers. Auto Quantize Notes rounds up the position of incoming MIDI notes to the nearest grid position, depending on the snap grid selection setting. If you want to hear each audio sample while going through them in the file browser, you can check Auto Preview. When checked, Automation Follow will make our automated XY coordinates, knobs, faders, and buttons in our built-in effects physically respond to changes made with the automation during playback. Overwrite MIDI will, when enabled, just overwrite MIDI on a track instead of just adding to it when recording. Play Notes will make sure that any newly drawn, selected, or moved MIDI note is actually played out. Here you can also select if notes are shown as sharps or flats, toggle your virtual keyboard, and also hide or show return tracks. The next section in the transport bar has mostly informational character. Here you can see the time code of the playhead, determine CPU usage, to see if you need to freeze a track or two, and the master audio output level, which is important because if that turns red, you are clipping. Here we also have a few indicators. First one showing you when your hard drive is not fast enough to read all the audio files your project is trying to play back. The second one detects the MIDI input and lights up blue. And the third one is a switch you can turn on to turn your computer keyboard into a virtual MIDI keyboard so you can play notes. This fader is the volume level of the metronome. After these punch in and out buttons, which are just shortcuts to the functionality we've seen in the options menu, we get to the essential executive actions for SoundBridge: record, play and stop, which do exactly what their names imply. Under which two buttons, delete, used for deleting elements, and shift, used for selecting multiple elements. These come in quite handy if you're using SoundBridge on a touchscreen. Swing Tool button opens a dialog where you can create a swing quantization setting that will be added to your beat selector. Choose between 8th note, 16th note, or 32nd note division, and dial in your preferred amount of swing. Clicking Add to Snap will add the current setting to the Snap beat selector, and Quantize will quantize all the current selected events in the project to the setting you just made. BPM selector determines the playback speed in beats per minute. You can change it by dragging up and down or by typing in a desired value. Right under it is the count-in selector, but the value here determines its length before the sequence begins to play. Time Signature button opens a dialog that allows for setting up a time signature for the project. The only item in this next section that is not a checkbox is this drop-down list called the beat selector that we mentioned before when talking about the snap function. Snap and beat selector are there to set the measure for the snap function so that all the elements on the timeline get snapped to the musical grid of the song. So the smaller the value in the beat selector, the more precise your snap will be. The loop functionality will loop the contents between the loop markers until interrupted. Metronome will provide you with the click for every beat in the musical time signature you set up. And since music production usually follows a fixed grid line, Snap will help you get those MIDI, automation, and audio events snap in line with the grid. Follow will make SoundBridge follow your playhead if it moves out of the view, so that you can always see the part of the song that is currently playing. Count In will play metronome clicks for 1 or 2 bars before the recording starts. This will help you get into the beat when recording a live performance. This row of buttons will change the functionality of your mouse cursor, changing it from a select tool into a draw tool, which you can use to draw in new blocks, MIDI notes, automation points, controller information, or stretch points for audio. The same functionality is provided with the beat detection sensitivity, which will make your cursor magnetically attached to transients near audio events. The same applies for the cut tool, which can also be clicked twice and become transient sensitive. And lastly, you have your mute tool for muting individual blocks of audio, MIDI, or automation rather than muting the entire track. The question mark button is an integrated tutorial to help you with any SoundBridge functionality. Underneath those are the shortcuts that show the file browser, sequencer, edit window, mixer, and the insert rack. To close these off, undo and redo buttons divide them from the next section of shortcut buttons. Split, freeze, quantize, merge, adjust length, and duplicate are all there to make your life easier and menu-free as much as possible. One thing we did not get into detail about is the freeze dialog box. In it, you can choose which tracks from your project you want to freeze and where you want to bounce those tracks. Choosing to a new track will bounce the audio of the selected tracks into a new audio track. And you can also choose if you want to bounce them in blocks, mute the original tracks that were frozen, or normalize the audio of the newly created tracks. This is useful for making your project good for archiving, as all plugins are rendered too. So when you open that project years after, you are sure to have all the elements still there. Choosing File will let you bounce selected tracks as files in a specific location on your hard drive, which is good for making stems out of projects for remixing purposes. option called In Place will freeze the track and leave the audio playing in its mixer strip. You can reverse this process by entering the freeze dialog, deselecting the tracks you want to unfreeze, and clicking OK.